Thinking Practice is my own company. I left the Arts Council of England 2.5 years ago. The first set of research I did around resilience very much came out of that context, though, so it is worth mentioning just for a second. I'd been at worked at Arts Council of England for 10 years. The last 5 of those as the executive director in the North East office, and we had been through in the North East a massive capital expansion of our infrastructure in arts and culture, very much part of a culture-led regeneration, particularly of Newcastle Gateshead, the two places which make one conurbation either side of the River Tyne, and also further south in Middlesbrough. So culture was very much part of places trying to reinvent themselves. And what we found ourselves trying to grapple with was how do we help the infrastructure that we've created, how do we best help that sustain itself, given that our finances are always finite, even when they were growing, they weren't infinite, and we could sense them shrinking. We've had quite large cuts in the arts in the UK in recent times, but actually that started in the latter days of the previous government. So it's not necessarily just a post-2008... I learned a new acronym earlier from someone. GFC, was that the phrase? Global Financial Crisis, which I had to check. I felt really stupid when I said, "What's that?" And, oh yeah, that I remember. It started in the Northeast when Northern Rock Bank went ping. So those cuts started under the previous government. So how do we best sustain those individual organisations and the sector as a whole, so that we are still keeping that momentum forward, but not at the expense of the smaller organisations? How do we avoid pushing all our money into keeping the gas bills and the electric bills of the big buildings being paid? And I became increasingly frustrated with the word sustainability. It was part of the Arts Council script to say, is your business plan sustainable? And people go, yes, it is. And we were supposed to go, oh, tick, move on. And it became, it started to feel like a ridiculous question for us to be asking, because actually the answer was yes, if you sustain it with your grant. So I started looking around for concepts that were more helpful to the kinds of decision-making dilemmas that we had, and I came across. These are some of the titles, uses of the word resilient. I came across this book here, Resilience Thinking, by Brian Walker and David Salt, which is about social-ecological systems. And various things started to click into place for me, and I kind of went on a bit of a search for how these frameworks might be used. Resilience is one of those words which has multiple applications in different disciplines. There is very much, and I think there's been a lot of work done in New Zealand around the use of resilience as a concept for managing risks of natural disasters and so on, and I think that may be true in Australia as well. There is a business resilience kind of literature as well about how organisations stay strong and true. There is a whole literature around psychology and particularly child psychology and the resilience of children to bad things happening to them. It also comes up in some of the thinking around transition towns and how we might transit. I shy away from using the word transition as a verb, but how we make that transition from a heavily oil and carbon based economy to something that is more planet friendly, and it's come up in that context. How do we make small places resilient? And as I did say at the Regional Arts Australia conference, the place I come from in England, in Teesside, is, according to all the metrics, the least economically resilient place in Britain, Middlesbrough, which is about 5 miles away, is the least. So how do we use all of those different things in the cultural sector was what I started to grapple with. And the conclusions that I came to, I think if I feel I did anything, I put some things in a different context and in a different shape, perhaps, than they'd been done before. But I don't claim that there's great rocket science discoveries in there. So I used this epigraph in the paper, which is it's one of my favourite quotes. It comes in handy quite often as a disclaimer, which is why I put it at the beginning of this talk. André Gide, the French novelist, said, "Everything has been said before, but since nobody listens, we have to keep going back and beginning all over again." Nobody might be putting it a bit strong, but some of these things will sound common sense because they are common sense, actually, but common sense is not necessarily all that common. Or we sometimes know things without actually putting them into practice. This is one of the other epigraphs from that first paper, which Darwin had his bicentenary, didn't he, recently? And you couldn't move for this quote, which I didn't realise when I used it. "It's not the strongest species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the most responsive to change." And I think that that's a really important idea for me about resilience in the cultural sector, where resilience has to be, if it's going to be culturally valuable and culturally productive, has to be about more than simply survival at all costs. For me, adaptive resilience needs to be about not just the big beasts, the big venues, the things that you just cannot afford to let close because of, the building is too big to have the shutters up, or it's got that word national in front of it and it would be a disgrace for the politicians if something bad happened to it. It can't be about just those. It has to be about how we keep change and innovation going in the sector. And that might be in those bigger organisations as well as the smaller ones, but we need that mix. And those people who are not able to change or not willing to change, I think, are going to be the ones that struggle, no matter how intelligent or resourceful they are in other ways. So this is one of the kind of, again, a key idea for me in thinking about adaptive resilience, and it's why I created this rather clumsy phrase in a way, with adaptive resilience, because resilience to me sounded too, on its own as a word, sounded too static. It sounded too survival based, and we needed some survival, but we also needed something to do with change. C.S. Holling is one of the natural ecologists, socio-ecologists. And in Nature, he talks about the fundamental paradox is that change is essential and yet stability is necessary. And when I read that, I thought, that is my experience of running arts organisations. That if you have no stability, it's a highly stressful, highly difficult place to be, and a difficult place to work and a difficult place to plan. If you have no change, though, it's dull, it's not culturally productive, and you are going to fall off at some point because you will no longer be relevant, maybe not immediately, but at some point. So somehow we need, and I think that applies both to individual organisations and to sectors as a whole, that if we have a completely fixed sector where no one's coming in, no one's moving on, and no one's changing what they do, it will get very fixed. If it's complete chaos all the time, that makes it very difficult for things to grow over periods of time, for people to have some fixed reference points to orientate themselves by. And managing that, I think, is one of the key things for funders and development bodies, and negotiating that is one of the key things for arts organisations and for sectors as well. You know, I know there's a few people in here who are sector development bodies of one sort or another, and how you get that mix of change and stability, I think, is a key part of the art of doing sector development. So, actually, I'll just leave that there for a while. I also really like that picture because that's what it felt like when I ran an arts organisation. You know, if he stays still, he's going to fall off. If he jumps around too much, those cups are going to go crashing to the ground, and he's not going to be able to catch that one in the air. So what I did originally was a set of case studies and interviews of organisations which had proved to be resilient over time, that had lasted for decades, but that had been through changes within that time. Some had ups and downs, but had stayed culturally productive. And I did a lot of reading, literature reviews of those different domains. And then I tried to boil it all down to make some sense. The first paper that I wrote, Making Adaptive Resilience Real, is very much about setting out the territory. What I've been doing in the couple of years since then is I think gradually honing in on the kind of practical aspects. There was a sense in that I felt I needed to try and change some of the language that we were using in the UK at the time. And it's one of those things that actually occasionally I feel a bit guilty now when people... resilience is one of those words that you can't... Again, it's in lots of the policy documents, and people occasionally accuse me of having had an influence in that, and I go, yeah, I'm sorry for creating a buzzword, but it's quite a useful word. Let's just use it and play with it on our own terms. So I came up with this definition, which is quite long. You don't have to even read it to see that. And I debated a lot how to summarise it. As I say, resilience was too simple and static for me. Some people that I work with suggested that we have transformational resilience, because it was all, the arts were all about transformation. And I wanted something less sexy than that. So I went for adaptive. Partly that comes from the literature of how ecologies adapt. I kind of use creative resilience a lot more these days as well when I'm talking about it, because I think I probably underplayed that in some of the first things. So this was the definition: the capacity to remain productive and true to core purpose and identity, whilst absorbing disturbance and adapting with integrity in response to changing circumstances. The things that I'd kind of underline there, or put in red, there is a key thing here about staying true to yourself as an organisation, as well as individuals, and as a sector, and not letting that go, and not being sort of pulled off course by circumstances or perhaps by funding. One of the things that's very common, has been very common in the past in the UK, is for organisations to gradually suffer mission drift by chasing the funding. You know, the funder will have a specific fund with some a particular target, and people go, there's money there, let's do that. Or there's some commissions to be got there. And then 3 or 4 years later, they find they're doing something that's actually quite some way from what they really want to be doing. And sometimes it can be hard to get back to that core identity unless you really hold on to that and use that to inform your decision about, do we go for that commissioning process for, you know, arts and health, say? You know, is that really what we're about? If it is, great. If it isn't, you should take it on very, very cautiously, I'd say. So knowing yourself and having that culture is really key. Absorbing disturbance, just want to say a little bit about that, because I think some people, understandably probably, have felt that that was quite a defensive phrase. Disturbance, you know, it suggests things coming from outside. So, you know, classics are cuts in funding, and other disturbances might be chief exec leaves is a classic one in an organisation. Long-standing member of staff changes, it creates a disturbance because everything has to move around. But it can also be, the reason I kind of highlight it is it can also be positive things that create a disturbance. And I'll say a little bit more about that. But a hit can be as destabilizing for an organisation, a touring theatre company, for instance, as a flop, because it can shift what you do for the next 3 years if there's a real demand for it. And again, it's sometimes tempting for people to really milk a hit and then find that actually they've not been doing the R&D work that they're really devoted to. And adapting with integrity to those changing circumstances. I think that just underlines the point I was making before, and you need to relate this back to your sense of who you are. I think I probably also underplay in this definition something about shaping those circumstances. I do think that we have the potential, at least in certain spaces, to shape our circumstances as well as simply be victims. I think resilience is one of those words that sometimes can seem as if it's the world is going to throw bad stuff at me. How do I make myself strong against it? And there is undoubtedly an element of that, but there's also an element of I am going to shape the world around me as an organisation and to the extent that I can. And how do we do that? So these are just a few things I would, if it wasn't already long enough, I'd try and crowbar in now after 2 years of working with it. There's something about creativity within that productive and true that arts organisations have particularly, I think. There's something about using the disturbance. It's almost that, I don't do judo, but it's that judo thing of use the weight of the attacker, use the disturbance positively for yourself, and shaping the circumstances. This is a picture of a roller coaster. I think this might be the one that's on the Arts Queensland blog, actually. One of the images that people used when I was talking to these chief execs, and they were chief execs of organisations ranging from the National Theatre and Glyndebourne Opera at that kind of at that national, rather establishment level, through to community arts organisations in small towns. And this image of the roller coaster kept cropping up. And sometimes it was people who'd been chief exec of an organisation for 25 years, or had been with the organisation for 25 years, and they said it's been a roller coaster, it's been up and down. Or people who had come in at a crisis point, had to stabilise the organisation, had to make lots of changes, and they used that phrase as well. So I became kind of really interested in this metaphor, I suppose. And what struck me was that, eventually struck me, sometimes you have to wait for metaphors to work out what they mean, let your brain work out what they might mean, was that the roller coaster, when people used it, they were often talking about that sense, that feeling of danger, that feeling of a loss of control that one has. But what struck me was that if your roller coaster is well built, that sense of danger it's in your gut, but actually your head should be saying, "Oh, it's all right. This thing has been bolted on by trained professionals. I'm going to get to the end of it." So I started to think, well, actually, part of what we're doing in arts organisations is designing our work, our organisation, so that we can enjoy that ride, because you will have that ride. I think there's no doubt about that. But some people, their organisations fly off the metaphorical roller coaster. It also struck me that the roller coaster is a bit like this picture, which comes from the ecological literature. This is called panicky, which is not what you feel when you're panicking, although it might be. But a series of adaptive cycles that connect. Partly this is just a sort of visual connection that my brain made, but this picture is in the Making Adaptive Resilience reel, because I think it captures for me some of what the system of culture does. It creates ways in which small, fast cycles, those experimental organisations that are doing things really quickly, perhaps come and go, new companies making new work. The revolt, the people who are going, actually, this is all nonsense. We need to get rid of all you old guys and let us do our work. That can gradually through time connects to the slightly larger and slower cycles that a thing like a state library or a national museum might be going through. So there's a visual thing there that connects, for me, the entirety, it's a big word, and the entirety of what's going on in culture and how it all relates to each other. It's, for me, I suppose one of the important things is we should try not to see this as a battle for power, funding, or ground between the smaller and the bigger organisations. We should try and see it as a design challenge for how we have a sector that has all of them in it. Based on that that is based upon this adaptive cycle, which I'll talk through because this is quite a key concept, I think. And this is based on, again, it's sort of borrowed from ecology, but also business. It comes up in business literature as well. I've simplified it. As you'll see in that, in this picture, there are ways of doing it with the kind of there'll be a word for it, but I don't know, the infinity kind of loop. I simplified it, rightly or wrongly, to make it just a bit easier to grasp into this cycle. So, disclaimer: people don't always move smoothly through these 4 phases in sequence. And what the adaptive cycle suggests is that things occupy one of 4 phases. If we start off in that top left-hand corner, the growth phase, the key thing here is that things are free in the growth phase. They're freed up. They're not tied down. They're not owned and fixed. So in a growth phase, you have competition for resources. So, if, for instance, the government suddenly decides that it's going to spend an extra 10% on arts funding, that 10% is not fixed down, and there's some competition for those resources. If someone moves into the sector wanting to invest in a different way, that's new. You got innovation in the growth phase, people trying things out, people doing things in different ways. You often have development of networks in that growth phase. People come together, often to try and get those resources or to move into the space that's been created. But you also get duplication. Sometimes you have 2 people trying pretty much the same thing out. The growth phase might be a new building. So a new building opens in a town. Suddenly there's new rehearsal space, there's new production space that can be used, that people can move into. On an individual basis, perhaps the easiest way of thinking about what happens in that growth phase is a startup company. Startup young theatre company. Nothing's fastened down. Everyone's doing everything. They're moving around very rapidly. Generally, over time, those things become calmer and a bit more fixed. And move into what I called consolidation. Some of the ecological literature uses the phrase conservation, but that had a kind of difficult resonance for me in the cultural sector, so I went for consolidation. So things become locked up. You get the regular bookings in the rehearsal space. You have fixed programs in your new venue. You have job titles in your new organisation and job descriptions. That's the bit where you start to go, hold on, we need some job descriptions for all these new people that we need to bring in. Capacity is built. So, that's the classic capacity building phase of an organisation or a sector. Things become more efficient, in inverted commas of efficiency, but they also become more fixed. And the longer you stay in that, there is a temptation for both sectors and organisations to devote more of their energy to staying like that. You know, we need the funding so that we can keep those people in jobs, not so that we can do that activity, which is probably what you were doing, what people might do in the growth phase, which makes you increasingly vulnerable to something coming along because you've got less flexibility. And you have to really, I think the successful organisations in that really pay attention to what's going on around them to keep stimulating them. Often then, something comes along that makes some change. Disturbance creates change. So, you know, as I mentioned earlier, classic examples are chief exec leaves. So all the roles that you'd built up around that chief exec are suddenly up for question, particularly when the new chief exec comes in and starts having a look round. Perhaps that disturbance is the commissioner, the programme commissioner at a theatre that you toured to regularly. They move on, nothing to do with your organisation, but suddenly you haven't got that relationship that you had, so you need to find different ways. And things get freed up, and often it's a very rapid change process there in that release phase. A cut in funding is a kind of negative example of that, where you're suddenly having to go, what do we do? What are we going to do now? How do we free things up and go back? And then you'd move into the reorganisation phase, renewal and redesign, change. And sometimes people might, one of the things that certainly in the UK, the arts sector is not good at, and I think the whole of the voluntary sector is not good at, is when in that release phase, asking themselves that question, are we still needed? Do we still need to do what we're doing? You know, does the world need us? Do our users need us, our audiences? And actually sometimes one of the things I think we're very bad at is going, actually, you know what? The thing that we were set up for 20 years ago isn't needed anymore. So we either have to do something really different or even wind up. You know, wind-ups are very few and far between. And then if you go through that again, you kind of will enter into those other phases again. I'm going to pause there just for a second and ask you a question. Of those, assuming I've explained those clearly, of those 4 phases, I'd like you to just think which would be the phase you like working in the most. If you can think of your experience working in the cultural sector, you may have been through more than one of those phases in your time. And which is the one that made you get out of bed most excited? And I'm going to ask you to put your hands up and do a straw poll. So, if you prefer operating in the growth phase, put your hands up. Put them up high so I can see properly. So that's quite a lot. Yeah. Consolidation. A few, got 3 there. Release. Thrill seeker in the front row. And reorganisation. So quite a few for that, actually. So on most of you, I think we're on that left-hand side. I quite often do this when I do versions of this talk. And the really interesting thing is that there's a very small minority of people, of arts managers, or people likely to come. This is one of those statistical things. I'd have to say something. Of people likely to come to a talk by Mark Robinson, a very small proportion of them like working in the consolidation phase. I just beg, you know, it just makes me think, I wonder what that says about us as a sector, about our strengths and our weaknesses. I'll just leave that there, and perhaps we can come back to that in the discussion. Yeah, here we go. I think behind that feeling is that one of the challenges that I've had about this work is some people have said to me, not everything needs to be resilient, Mark, does it? Not every arts organisation needs to last for 30 years. And I think there's some truth in that sector. You need some of those fast cycling things where people will move on and the individuals might move on into more fixed bits of the infrastructure. But this is one where I think my thinking has become a bit clearer, in that I think that certain arts organisations are the disturbance in the sector rather than the environment. So again, I'm not going to ask you to put your hands up about this now, but I think this is a question that I now ask arts organisations when I'm working with them on business plans and strategies and stuff. Is your role primarily to shake things up in your sector and to free some things up and to take some ground, or is it to provide that environment to which other people can connect? And I think having some clarity about what that is can help shape some of the decisions that you might have to make about your organisation. So if I used to run a poetry press, a small press publishing a magazine and books of poetry. That was never meant to last for very long. Lasted for 9 years, which is probably about 2 years too long, actually. But it was never meant to last very long. So, not that I didn't need a reserves policy for that organisation. If I'd been running the local arts centre, I did. So it's just a very kind of black and white example there. This is just to point this out, because I suppose it's running through the things that I say. It's one of the words I learnt whilst I was researching this work, recursion, which it's not things happening again and again, but things happening at different levels, the same pattern applying to individuals and our resilience, which certainly in my own experience, I can see some of those adaptive cycle phases reflected there. Organisation and its resilience in the sector, you get this, I do think you're seeing the same patterns at different scales, rather like in this picture where it's one of those, the picture is on the box, is on the cup in the box. Just want to throw this one in, which is from the psychological research, and I think this is something that, again, it's something that arts organisations help others do, but it's also something they need to do themselves. It comes from some research in Hawaii, I think, about children who'd been through traumatic experiences, and 4 characteristics of those children who did prove to be resilient. Active problem solving. So practicing our problem solving skills helps to make us more resilient. Having a constructive approach to experiences, even bad experiences or difficult experiences. The ability to gain others' positive attention is one of those key skills. And certainly in the UK, and I think from the conversations I've had in Australia so far, that ability to gain people's positive attention about our value as a sector, the ability to tell our story, to talk about our value in ways that are meaningful to our own identity, but also to other people, strikes me as really important. And maintaining a positive vision of a meaningful life. Again, it's my sense is that this is one of the things that people who work in the arts are pretty good at, by and large. We don't go into work and go, it's all bloody awful. We might go, it's hard and it's difficult, but we have got this a generally positive vision because we're making things, and we're making things happen, and making things even on a small scale tends to give you a sense of positivity. Built on that then, I identified 8 characteristics of organisations that tend to be resilient. And I'm going to talk through these. Again, my thinking has kind of just moved on a little since I wrote the papers, particularly influenced by some work that I did looking at the role of diversity in building adaptive resilience. And some case studies I did with another guy, Tony Wakuku, looking at that. In smaller organisations, organisations often working with either what we'd call BME communities, black minority ethnic communities in England, or working in disability fields, which led me to make that big circle in the middle even bigger. That the core thing that organisations that tended to be resilient had was they knew what they were about. And it was that classic thing that if you asked the receptionist, you got the same answer as you did from asking the chair or the chief exec. And I started to be able to tell whether this organisation was kind of in the right area almost as soon as I arrived, because people would talk to you differently. It was just, I always remember going to the Theatre Royal Stratford East in East London, just by the side of the Olympic Park now, which was a hell of a disturbance for their business model. They've been there 40, 50 years. It's the theatre where Joan Littlewood of Oh What a Lovely War fame, is where she based herself, been through all sorts of ups and downs. Not very many chief execs, they all tend to stay for 20 years and hand it on to their deputies. But this culture of shared purpose was absolutely present through everybody that I spoke to, from the ladies in the box office when I arrived to the chief exec's PA. And it was absolutely consistent, and not in a mechanical way, but in a very deep way. I'll talk through these. So, yeah, they had very clearly defined visions and purposes. I think for sectors, that's particularly challenging. You know, how do people who are working in poetry reach a consensus about what poetry publishing is trying to do in Queensland or Australia? And I do think you need to have a diversity of views within that. So having a clearly defined vision and purpose isn't about a monocultural one of whatever sort. It's about having a rich thing. But it needs to be a consensual story about the nature and the impact. In that kind of culture, you do see mentoring very often. You do see challenge and innovation and debate. But it's respectful debate and it's productive debate rather than, well, it's actually dialogue probably more than debate. It's not, I'm right, no, I'm right. It's, I think this, well, I think this, and then a third idea coming out, which becomes that consensual story. So developing that, I increasingly think is the kind of core, the key leadership task, either in an organisation or in a sector. Financial resources tend to make you more resilient. That's one of those kind of obvious statements, obvious sounding statements. But what I found was that people who had a range of reliable income streams, so of different sorts, tended to be more resilient. And there's something in there about the predictability and volatility. More predictable, good, so long as it's not very volatile. And I think there's an inbuilt threat for lots of subsidised organisations there, where people can be their income is very predictable, but only for 2-3 years. And then how do you plan for what changes might come after that funding cycle that you may have? One of the things that I wrote about, and that I certainly in the UK we're not in a good place on, is having a clarity about what's the revenue for the activity and what's the money that we're using for business capital, for growth or for development of assets that we can use in the future. It's one of the areas of the report that the funders didn't really pick up. And it's challenging to do that when government want outputs, they want activity, they want bums on seats, they want economic aspects. They don't want to hear that the reserves of the sector have gone up by 10%. But actually, the fact that reserves not need to go up is a key thing for the health of the sector. That's something we're still grappling with. So organisations, I think, should try and have that balance. Portfolio of strategic options, you know, is about a portfolio approach, spreads the risk, and also gives you more strengths to build on. Philanthropy possibilities. I understand from conversations I've had here that philanthropy is coming through as a kind of policy direction in Australia in a similar or parallel way to the way it is back home. I think that is hugely challenging for some organisations. It really, certainly in England, it benefits large national London-based organisations hugely. Something like 71% of philanthropic giving goes to London, and most of that goes to about 7 organisations, which is actually the parallel to the state funding, to be fair, but it concentrates rather than spreads. And that's often the one that organisations I've worked with kind of grapple. You know, they go, well, yeah, we can do the leadership things, we can do the culture, but the money is slightly harder for us. Having connection makes you more resilient. If we think of our personal lives, if we've got friends and family we can call on when we've got a problem, we're more resilient than if we've got nobody to ring when we're stuck somewhere or we need help or we need to borrow a tenner. And it's a similar thing for organisations. It has a kind of internal and external aspect to this that I've identified. Internally, organisations, particularly those bigger ones, tend to have good connection internally, so they don't have those silos, silo working anyway. They might have departments, but equally I've seen some very interesting ones where they've just almost completely done away with departmental working. Contact Theatre in Manchester, which is one of the case studies I looked at on the diversity work, fantastic work with young people and education, doesn't have an education department. Doesn't even have an education worker, I don't think. It's just completely spread throughout all of their activities, through their production and their development and their talent development workers. And you've got that connection at a variety of levels. Again, in that diversity work, we identified that actually those organisations who were most embedded in their local communities, it wasn't just the chief exec who was out and about being the face of the organisation. More staff at all different levels were involved in that. Craft Space, which is a sort of regional craft development organisation in the East Midlands of England, for instance, gave every single member of staff a budget to take somebody out to lunch every 6 months. So not just the chief exec who could go, let's do lunch, we must talk about X. Every member of staff was expected to be networking and bringing that knowledge back into the organisation and representing the organisation outside. So it made them much more connected, and they'd use that very practically to make sure some of their projects worked successfully. But there is also that whole collaborative working. Networks is one of those things, again, I've got a slide in a second about that, that networking has sometimes a kind of, can feel like a waste of time to a lot of people. It can feel like it sucks you. I don't know whether that's the same in Australia, but certainly it may be very different in the UK because it's so much more compact, perhaps. But some people can feel like they do nothing but go to network meetings, and you have to make it purposeful, I think. Having some assets helps. Simple. Buildings, spaces, intangible assets, there might be skills, might be intellectual property. Having some strong networks, I think, can be an asset. Obviously, having a building is an asset, might also be a liability, depending on how well designed it is and how costly it is. But having some assets that are feeding into the revenue stream of your organisation really, really helps. That requires investment. assets don't happen by accident, based on my research. And sharing knowledge of what exists. When I've worked sometimes with people in geographic areas, there's this classic thing that happens when you get people in the room and they list everything that they've got, and people go, "Oh, I never knew about that." Or, you know, it's the classic thing that comes out of an audit in the arts. People go, "We never knew there was so much in, you know, Brisbane or Gulwar or wherever you are." And if people don't know about it, it's not really an asset. Certainly not a shared asset for the community. So building up those assets can really help. Adaptive capacity, not the sexiest term. I wanted something that was more than innovation, though, partly because innovation is certainly an overused word in the UK at the moment. But can you change? Have you got the skills, the habits to change over time? So that might include peer review and critique. So do people in your sector, in your town, critique the work and use that to help stimulate better work in future? Have you got the systems to do that? And I know your funding system is based on certainly a greater degree of peer input than we have, for instance. So how does that drive change in the sector, or doesn't it? You can tell whether you've got adaptive capacity by looking at what you do now and what you do 10 years ago. If it's the same, if your program structure is exactly the same, I'd suggest you probably haven't got a great deal of adaptive capacity because you haven't changed, unless your program was perfect, which congratulations. So you can those innovations will lead to a new normal, to use that phrase. The sector, at a sectoral level, you'll see some adaptation and influence of the environment. I guess, you know, e-books, the music industry is very much having to do that as well. And you see some risk-taking. Risks taken in an informed and responsible way. That sounds really boring, doesn't it? Irresponsible risks as well, actually, sometimes are necessary. Resilient organisations and sectors have strong leadership. This thing about clarity of purpose and values. One of the things that I think at a sector level we're very good at is knowing what we, agreeing on what we think our sector's for. But when you check it with the external perception of that, there's sometimes a gap. I don't think we're as good as we think we are. Certainly, again, UK experience. At making sure the external world is on the same page as us. As I was saying to Kathy last night, in England, certainly the sector tends to do what English people do when they're in Europe, which is if the person talking to them doesn't understand, is just say it again, but louder and slower, and it doesn't necessarily work. The person doesn't get any less French. Industry bodies are playing a role in that, I think, and they're very much a future focus. And then the last two kind of go together, and these are both phrases that are taken from some of the disaster planning frameworks. Situation awareness, knowing what's going on around you. Do you know what your audience is, how your audience is changing? Do you know how your artists are changing? Do you know what the demographic of people coming out of colleges in your particular art form might be, and what's going on? Technology as well. One of the case studies we did when looking at diversity, we looked at a non-arts one, and we looked at a very big law firm, very establishment, waiters in the meeting rooms. But what really struck me was that they took diversity far more seriously than almost any arts organisation I'd gone into. And they did that because they knew what was happening to their workforce. They were entirely reliant on their workforce. They were a talent-driven organisation, the global HR director told me, which I would suggest the cultural sector would probably say we're all about talent and creativity. And he said, law graduates in London, 50% women, 50-something % non-white. And his customers didn't want white males, a white male team of lawyers, and he wasn't going to have the talent if he simply recruited in the standard way. So he was very much aware of that situation. Sharing information openly should be something that's much more possible now than it was 10 years ago because of the way that we can collect data and share it digitally and on the web and live as well. Certainly in the UK, again, we're far from where I think we could be on that. I don't know whether there's anything you could tell me about Australia there. And then finally, it helps, if you want to be resilient, to manage your vulnerabilities. Know where you're vulnerable and actively manage those. This is a bit more than risk management for me. I mean, I think everybody ought to be doing that kind of risk management for whatever their organisational context is. But this might, your vulnerabilities might be, your biggest vulnerability might be that the Australia Council won't fund you next time, in which case you need to be developing actions that will shore that up and make sure that that risk is less diminished. It might be your biggest vulnerability is that you're not getting the artistic talent to come and work with you that you want, in which case you need a strategy for that. Keeping some flexibility is often one of the big challenges for arts organisations in the UK. It's one of the things I still struggle with. I'm on the board of a number of organisations and try and practice what I preach there. So I am the squeaky wheel board member who goes, that training budget's ridiculous. Can we put a 0 on the end of that, please? And then the chief exec looks at me wearily and goes, yes, where would you like me to take the 0 off? And you get into that debate. But not spending all our money on outputs is the basic flexibility that I think, and that's a discipline. It's a bit like a personal discipline. But that's, for me, is a really important one. To say a few things about roller boards, because I know we've got some board members here, and it's one of the things about the cultural sector that many people who have in exec jobs are also board members of other things. I think we do need to take that long-term view as board members of asset development and use those tough choices, make some tough choices about reserves and the use. Boards, I think, need to be very active, eyes and ears, and occasionally mouth for the organisation. I think there's an underlying theme in my thinking about resilience to do with learning, and that having that learning organisation, one that learns from its experience, learns from outside. And I think board members have got a really important role to play in that because they're less tied into the day-to-day activity. They can help staff to learn from that. The kind of classic check and challenge role as well. Underlying that, I think those are the kind of 4 things that a mindset that helps people to be resilient: being reflective, being open, adaptive, and responsible. Taking responsibility for ourselves and our situations. Not entirely. We're not to blame for everything that happens, but we do. Neither are we victims of other people's discussions and decisions. I'm going to skip over that one. For me, that has an implication to do with where we might end up, to do with the extent to which you can develop those characteristics and the extent to which you want to change. And this, I don't mean to suggest there's a value judgment here that, if you're more willing to change, if you're willing to change everything, that's better than willing to change nothing. But I think they have different consequences. And I kind of created this little quadrant. I was practicing to be a consultant at the time, so I thought 2x2 matrices, going to have to use those at some point. I can think of organisations who would fit into these categories. Want to stress, you can make great art in all of those places. But if you don't want to change and you've got very little resource, or you've only got that one source of funding, you are probably vulnerable and dependent. So you need to just respond to react, and you need to know that and know who you're dependent upon and what the deal is. If you've got lots of the resources but you don't want to change, you might fall into what I call the coping persistence way. There's organisations who never really hit a crisis point and just kind of crack on and do what they do. Being really up for change and having no resources is a frustrating place to be, from my observation. Some of you may have been there. So they're what I call the frustrated innovators. If they could get those resources and build those characteristics up, they could really do more. The top right is probably where you've got most control, or you feel you have most control. And I think that feeling is quite important, actually. It's not to be downplayed. I'm going to push on a little. And just finish with 2 or 3 more ideas. This relates back to the assets. Just want to say a few things about assets before I finish. I sort of suggested that there are basically 2 kinds of arts organisations. Those organisations, I suppose I'm talking about subsidised and funded organisations here. Those people who fill up the tank on the first day of the financial year, I don't know when your financial year is in Australia, but it would be the 5th of April in England, and you get your grant, and you flog that car as hard and as sensibly as you can until the money runs out. And hopefully that's about the end of March. And you're getting as much mileage as you possibly can from your income. And then there are other ones who are aiming for a kind of renewable energy, where some of that income is creating the asset that creates income in the future. But you do have to invest in that. You've got to put the solar panels on, to use that metaphor. And the best way to do that, I think, is through having an asset-based approach. One of the things that strikes me is that too many arts organisations don't use the byproducts or the possible byproducts of their activity as much as they could to create assets. There's just a quote from this very good book. If you've not read this book, I recommend it. It's a very quick read. Called Rework. When you make something, you always make something else. You can't just make one thing. Observant and creative business minds spot these byproducts and see opportunities. And I think that's true. I'm going to give an example. Kathy will recognise some of these examples because I know she knows Life Theatre. Life Theatre is a small theatre in Newcastle, in England. Very restricted capacity. So when it has a big show, it can't make its money through increased ticket things. And actually, if it doesn't sell out a show, it's a dud. It doesn't happen very often. It's had a lot of capital development, but it specialises in new writing. This image, the bottom left, I don't know whether the Pitman Painters has been to Australia. It's been all around the world. That was a play written by Lee Hall, the writer of Billy Elliot. It was turned into a film, and it's about the Ashington Painter Group, a group of miners in the 1930s, based on a true story, miners in the 1930s who became a bit of an art world sensation for a few years. Fantastic play, and a fantastic play about the role of art, actually. So if a version does ever come, and it's been through numerous iterations, started at Live, has then been co-produced with the National Theatre across Europe and New York. But they made very little money from that beyond those productions because they weren't able to buy the stake in the script they wanted. They're trying now to get to a stage where if that, other things by other writers, they would be getting some income from that. But they have used their assets in other ways. They developed the building, so it's now much more of a community function. They opened a pub, so not a bar in the theatre, but a pub down the road, to be part of the cultural offer of that street, but with the profit pays for one production a year in the theatre. So they invested specifically in what you would probably call non-arts activity so that it could support their other arts activity. Other way in which they use the byproduct, this example in the bottom right-hand corner, beaplaywright.com. Huge new writing expertise that they hold there that they weren't really getting any income from. They were getting some kudos from it, and it was probably making their Arts Council grant a bit safer. But they thought, how can we use the work that our writing development people are doing in the building through courses and so on to create other income streams that we don't have to tend so much. So they created an online playwriting course, which people all over the world can access, and which is, again, creating an income stream that drew from their activity. So they're using their assets, but they've got a very commercially minded chief exec who was looking for those opportunities. I'm going to skip over that because I've said that. So finally, how do you start? I'd say there's this sort of 5 things. Firstly, it's about assessing where you are. So how do we sit around those characteristics? What do we know about our core purpose? I do think this is a design challenge for arts organisations, or it's usefully approached as that. The shape and nature of our organisations isn't fixed. There are certain legal limits within which we have to operate, and practical limits that we should, again, see those as design challenges, I'd suggest. That might be easy for me to say. Plan. Once you've got that design, how do you get from A to B? You need a plan, you need a strategy. And bringing in the investment is very much part of having that story about who you are and what your value in the world is. Thinking of that Live example, they've been able to tell that story very powerfully, which has given people the trust to invest in things like that pub idea and things like the online playwriting idea. If they'd had a weaker story, that might have been riskier. And then do something. Act. Don't be done unto by the changing environment. I've probably just talked through those. I just like that picture. Identifying the views of the key stakeholders, I think, is often an important step for people. Sometimes we can be quite solipsistic in the arts. If we think we're failures or we think we're successes, we think everybody else does. And that may or may not be the case. Having the leadership and the champions to drive this through is really important, I think. As is collaborating. Resilience is not simply, it's the standalone strong figure or organisation, I think, is a bit of is a myth. It's a bit like the heroic leader, it's a myth. So, don't do that unless you're on a plane. Do that. I'm going to finish there and hand over to Kathy.
Thank you. to take the mic. Look, Mark, I'd like to thank you very much for that. And we're going to open it up to questions. I'm just going to throw 2 or 3 things in. First of all, it's terrific for me to get Mark, for us to be able to bring Mark over, because obviously it builds on a lot of the work that we've been doing in relation to sustainability, in relation to asset building, and the work that we're now doing with Foresters Community Finance, looking in particular at that whole asset and looking at new shapes and new ways of actually building financial resilience in order to access new forms of money. But just a couple of things that struck me straight away is that in relation to what you said and in relation to the audience, particularly Mark, we have today, and that is that stability and fixed reference points, the requirement of stability through change. And I suppose look at the small to medium sector in particular, and that constant thing of recognising that so many organisations within the S2M sector who actually do require that stability, and they are part of the stability within the ecology of the whole of the arts in Queensland. And I think it's a really crucial thing for us to keep remembering. The mission issue, going back to mission, going back to the whole notion of why we're here and what we're doing. I mean, some of you know we battle through this in business planning with organisations, trying to remember what it is and whether or not we're still useful, but then the redesigning of that in the context of what's the best model for us to actually achieve our mission within all the new things that are going on in the world. Big mess. I thought that was fascinating, Mark, that philanthropy statistic, because yes, you're absolutely right. Philanthropy is going to be pushed and pushed and pushed even more in Australia over the next few years, and we do have to keep bearing in mind that there will be winners and losers. I do think that technology, and obviously the whole issue of the use of crowdfunding and what is happening there in terms of looking at other ways for donors to actually assist organisations, is going to be incredibly useful, incredibly important. But again, philanthropists and donors through crowdfunding are usually only doing it for programs. They're not doing it for the organisation and for developing the assets of the organisation in terms of building resilience and building some form of stability within that. So that was terrific, and I'm sure everybody's going to take it all on board, but I'd really like to open it up now to questions from the audience, specifically to Mark. My first question, I suppose, quickly, is how you said governments haven't taken this on board very much in the UK. Are there any examples of where the funding bodies have actually seen the work that you've done, seen the work of Mission Models Money, the organisation in the UK that both Mark and I have an involvement in, and actually begun to shift some of their thinking, maybe, in terms of how governments fund and how governments use their money to build resilience?
I think it's the funding bodies that have yet to find the ways of spending the money in the appropriate fashion that I was referring to. I think people have got the main idea of the need for resilience. Arts Council England have, I forget the exact phraseology, but one of their 5 goals is to have a resilient sector. So there's something of the nod to the language there. But because of the peculiar way in which our investment is split now in England between what we would call treasury funding, so essentially government politically decided funding, and lottery funding derived from the National Lottery, it's become more difficult because essentially because of the cuts, almost all of the treasury funding goes to the regularly funded organisations, to that core infrastructure. And the lottery funding does the rest. So they're funding a lot of schemes through lottery funding, but because lottery funding has a much bigger emphasis on direct public benefit, it's quite hard to do, funding for reserves, funding for endowments, for instance, although they are experimenting with that. So there have been some matched funding schemes to do with to encourage philanthropy, both at the small scale and the large scale. But I think there's a big capacity building job to be done in the sector at the moment. And people are, you're right, I think, currently focused more on program than what you might call business.
I think we should be able to change that. I mean, one of the openings that strikes me is that most of the people that one is making those big asks of got their money from running businesses.
Yeah.
That's not, generally inherited wealth that's being spread around in that. And so there's some sort of business case that should be run, but whether people give their charitable money in the same way they do their investments, I'm not sure.
I just think that idea of investing in non-arts revenue-generating businesses is just fantastic. And I'm trying to now come up with a way to convince our board and our members to fundraise for a pub. But possibly, can you give us some other examples of that?
Well, I think there are a number of examples where there's more and more organisations have got trading companies now. So because most arts organisations in the UK are charitable, have charitable status, if they want to invest in pure driven commercial activity which will gift back to the organisation, they would set up a trading company. One of the organisations I'm on the board of is 7 Stories, which is the National Centre for the Children's Book in Newcastle. And we have, as you would expect, a bookshop, but it's not just the bookshop on the side. It's a commercial operation which also runs into schools and so on. I think there are also people providing, these are sort of byproducts as opposed to pubs. So there are people providing consultancy services increasingly, I think, creative spaces that can be used by other people. Conferencing is again a bit of an obvious classic, but it's interesting that recent round of capital funding in England, the only award in the northeast of England where I'm from was to build a conference centre on what's currently the car park next to the Sage Gateshead. There'll be very little cultural activity in that, but it was absolutely crucial to the business model for the Sage that they were able to do that. So that's just a few that spring to mind.
If anybody's interested in more examples of that, if you go onto the Mission Models Money website, you'll find some interviews with people who are doing things similarly. And I mean, I know everybody's looking for the same sort of ideas here as well at the moment. Sorry.
I think it's partly a mindset thing. I was just thinking of someone I know who runs artist studios, but set them up, and I think there are examples here of that, but set them up with a mortgage, a personal mortgage that he took out because the model was that he could cover that, and he's now expanded that into other areas, which is all going back into visual arts infrastructure.
That's it. I mean, some of the examples that we've got, and you'll get, and when you see the example from live theatre, from what's happened there, I mean, apart from having one of the best beers in Newcastle, Wylam, I don't know if you saw that, the beer sign, it was a very good beer. Jim did that, a lot of that through loan financing. Through working with non-profit finance providers, a bit like Foresters here, to actually build the business and make those things happen. So, but he was in a strong position anyway to be able to access that money in the first place. So I think the issue is more around, I suppose, the capacity building, which is what I was referring to, Mark, before, in terms of whether or not there were schemes and projects around that can actually help organisations build the capacity within themselves to be able to then move on and grow in the same way that you're wanting to do with your project, Vicky.
I really enjoy what your editor background and how you're very accurate with your terms. And I noticed that you've avoided reinvent. You used it initially at the beginning, probably just trying to explain something. Which I find, you talk about the static of certain words, but with reinvent, I think that there's a certain defeatist or even cynical intonation with that word. How careful were you with actually picking through the policy, the review you came out with, and is it published in anything?
I'm very careful. And yeah, I mean, the if you go onto the Arts Council of England's website, artscouncil.org.uk, you can find the 2 papers that I published on this subject, and there's a whole kind of heap of other things on my blog and on the website. I am very careful about those words, partly because I suppose there's 10 years as a bureaucrat, let's call it that, working with the Arts Council, but also as a writer prior, during, and after that period. I didn't want to lose all my friends whilst I worked at the Arts Council. I lost some of them, and I certainly lost some of my publishers. I didn't publish during that time. But I always remember the person who published my last book, who ran Flambard Press until very recently, when they lost their Arts Council funding after I left. Not that I had kept it, but she was. It's a bit of a cliche, but Margaret was the epitome of the formidable woman, a woman of certain age, big beehive, rather like a fierce version of Simone de Beauvoir. And I always remember her coming to the first presentation I did when I worked at the Arts Council, and she looked me in the eye and she went, "If you say a building capacity, I'm going to walk out." So I've always been very conscious of using phrases like that too readily. And it's one of the nervousnesses I have about this word, because I think buzzwords become buzzwords like cliches because they have some truth and some usefulness in, but they then can just become a label. And that was part of my frustration with, have you got a sustainable business plan? And I think it's my frustration or fear now with, are you resilient? Well, ask me tomorrow is probably the sensible answer to that. But having a sense of what those characteristics are, so yeah, it's an important one. I'm interested if any of that language feels odd to an Australian. We speak English, but perhaps not the same language.
Hello, Mark. I'm Elaine from Topology, and we're a group of musicians who play classical instruments, but we're always creating new music. And I wanted to know, just to go over the "Are you a disturbance or are you an environment" statement, because I'm thinking about how that applies to us. So we're a disturbance in the fact that we're always creating new music, even though we're a sort of a classical instrument group, but we do value very much being part of the environment. The musicians are very open to, sharing their experiences and being part of the musical community, but sometimes it feels like we're so different from all the other classical musicians because, they're obviously not creating new things all the time. There's not a lot of them out there who are creating completely new programs every single time they play. So I just wanted some more thoughts on that statement.
I'm a Libran, so I'm always a bit of both. But then on the other hand, I'm not. I guess the key thing is, if one had to pick one of those, is does a group like yours become something over time that other people can connect to? That otherwise might not be there. So if newer composers are coming out of universities and so on, and looking for those places to have their work performed, if they start to look to you and your group to do that, I would suggest that's the potential for becoming an environment yourself, as well as influencing the environment. The example, I used this example at the conference at the weekend of a festival. Some festivals only happen once or twice, and they only need to because they come in and they go, look at this new stuff. You know, it might be, look at this contemporary music, you know, classical tradition, and other people pick up on that. Other festivals, and that's their effect. That's how they change. That's how they change the world, is by causing an argument and people having that. Other festivals need time for people to connect to them, and then they can become a fixed point so that people can aspire to them and work into them and learn from them. And that doesn't happen in 1 or 2 years in my experience. It's what happens after you've been there for 10 or 20 or longer. And I think for some organisations, there is that thing of being alive to, do we carry on being the disturbance that we were for the first 2 years? Or do we, you know, start to look longer term of what we could do then? And I think that's a genuinely, for me, that's, again, it's not one is better than the other. It's just one may be more appropriate to that group of individuals in that particular context. There may be times where you go, people, I've seen sometimes organisations that sound a little like what you're describing. Often funders and development agencies look at a group like that and go, oh, they could be really useful for, you know, something to build on. And sometimes that's not the most appropriate thing. I've seen organisations go really badly wrong by having that kind of responsibility put upon them, when actually they should have gone, no, we don't want to be part of your strategy for industry development. We want to carry on being this, you know, the spiky thing over here. It's a version of the mission drift, I guess.
What happened? Because I think there's quite an interesting thing happened here at that time
Yeah.
in some organisations.
Well, some of them have gone or are in the process of going. They have tended to. There was, I felt, a disproportionate effect on smaller and artist-led organisations in that restructure. You know, it's the nature of funding cycles that some people lose their funding and other people get rises and new people come in, and you know, I was always quite comfortable with that, to be honest, as a funder. I saw that as the key part of my job, and you know, I cut some of my best friends whilst I was a funder, and most of them have carried on doing really great work. In that round, I think, as I say, there was a rather disproportionate effect because of the scale of the cut that was imposed on the Arts Council by government, on the smaller, on the artist-led, on the umbrella and service organisations. So people spent a lot of time rethinking what their constituencies were, rethinking what their value was. And I think some organisations took a decision to go, actually, this is just not, the gain, the potential gain is not worth the pain that we're going through of trying to keep this organisation going, and have gone, which is a shame. And I think we won't know the full ramifications of that for some time, because you don't, it's not that you don't know what you're going to, you don't miss your water till your well runs dry, I think. So it could be 2 years before we realise what we've lost, or that we realise that actually we don't miss it. There's been some mergers, particularly if those service organisations are working together, both formally and sometimes informally more. And some organisations, I think, have gone, actually, this has freed us up to work in different ways. Now that we're not, as well as the cuts, the funding requirements have become more bureaucratic for many smaller organisations, so that I think arguably it wasn't as appropriate even. So they've gone, let's work through projects, let's trim the staff down to a core, and then kind of gone with the film production company model of 2 or 3 people who are really driving the company, and then when you've got a project you expand, and then when you haven't got a project you shrink back. A lot of people drawing on their volunteering is a real pattern, and that's got its pros and its cons, I think. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think what will be very interesting is there's talk at the moment that there may be a kind of in-year cuts in England. So we generally have funding cycles that are pegged to government spending reviews, but this government is suggesting it might have an early one. And I think that will throw a lot of people who thought they were safe. A lot of the people who got funding are still having those discussions as well, because funding is never 100%. So it doesn't solve all your problems. It just makes some of your income more predictable.
Anybody else? Anything else? I'm sorry, I should actually say I didn't ask that question specifically because of anything that we think might be coming down the track. I asked it because I think it's just a really important issue in relation to resilience thinking.
Mark, really great talk. Thank you very much. And a lot of those examples will seem very familiar because I've only been in Queensland 4 years or so, but I know a lot of the companies you talked about. There are a couple of things I just wanted to unpick a little bit, if it's okay. And to give you a bit of a political dimension, here in Queensland, we've had a change of government 6 months ago, which is a huge sea change. And without going into the ramifications of that in detail, the arts are still adjusting to a new environment. And I'm interested in two things, really. Any examples you may have of how the arts could better represent itself to political, a changed political scene, and that point you make that we're not particularly good as an industry in getting our successes across and celebrating them publicly and making sure we get a political dimension to them, I think is a real issue anywhere in the world, and certainly in Australia. Having said that, Australia is a very resilient arts community, and there's lots of really good work here and very positive thinking stimulated by both the Australian attitude to life in general and the environment, the geography of the country and everything else. But one thing I would particularly like to hear more about is that comment you make about how the clarity around the difference between revenue for activity and revenue for business and capital growth, which I think in an environment of diminishing funding in real terms is a real issue, certainly for both organisations I represent here today, the Queensland Music Festival, which is quite a substantial core-funded organisation running across the whole state, but I'm also a board member of Metro Arts, which is a small company which is almost the equivalent of Oval House in London for Brisbane, but struggling with a dilapidated building and which constantly sucks away resources from activity.
That thing about the political themes. I get very frustrated when the arts world thinks that the arts world is the world in the UK. That we've had in the last few years, I think, a swing towards art for art's sake is not quite the term, but that it'll do for now, and away from expressing and valuing the other uses that the arts have that come from that arts for art's sake. So the arts community, prior to the last election and subsequently, became, I felt, very insular, and I think it's that insularity of thought. Sometimes that in the UK leads to that political argument not being carried. If I draw on the Northeast experience, I think the reason that we were able to carry a number of political discussions and debates and to get major investment from local authorities over a period of time was that we very much put the arts in the context of the overall well-being of the region and the life of the region. At times, that was done in a very instrumental way, probably, but most of the time it was done, I think, in a pretty holistic fashion. So it was we weren't selling, we weren't misleading anybody by suggesting, and we weren't denying the fact that the big galleries and the music halls were there for musicians and for audiences as well as for tourists and economic regeneration and so on. we had some very strong images, visual images that helped, and some very strong storylines, which helped. So, if I think back, the Angel of the North, which is a sculpture by Anthony Gormley, which is in Gateshead, is both a very resonant image for all those politicians, and it's also a great story for them. So they were able to tie into that. It's ebbed and flowed nationally, I think. So for me, there's something about images and really clear, sharp stories. I always think we can lose track. We're so passionate in the arts of all the things that politicians have to balance. I know local politicians better than I know national politicians, but it is not an easy balancing act, particularly in a cut situation like we've got in the UK. Of do you keep that grant at that level to your art gallery, or do you close that care home, or all the other things? And I think we just have to acknowledge that and respect that process. Actually, I'm not sure that not talking about Australia here, but I'm not sure the arts community has always done that in the UK. In terms of the revenue for building and against the revenue for activity, it's a real tough nut to crack, and I think I only kind of, it's not an original observation I picked up particularly on some American writing, but if we keep I think we have to keep identifying the problem and striving to find some solutions. I think there's something in there about discipline for organisations. I find myself saying words that sound very conservative when I talk about this sometimes. We have to have that discipline of putting some money towards our buildings every year when we can, rather than just simply going, well, yeah, they're dilapidated and we have to live with that money draining away. Let's put some investment towards it, and let's bring it in. There's something about our responsibility there that I think is important.
Thank you. John Waldron from Museum and Gallery Services, Queensland. I'm just interested to perhaps hear your perspective on the challenges for the heritage arts, and probably explain how this might resonate in a similar way. Like we've talked quite a bit about the creative arts, but no doubt it's a challenge worldwide, and Australia has some great challenges regionally with collections that are being looked after by elderly volunteers and so forth. And so I'm just wondering whether you could shed some light on the UK experience.
Yeah, it's a good point, and I wouldn't claim to be an expert in anything actually, but I would claim to be less expert in heritage than I am in the creative end of the cultural sector. I do think when you look at it through the resilience frame, there is potential there for those collections to be, assets that drive business, drive revenue, and drive the engagement that I think is behind. That's the common factor for me between what we might label heritage and what we might label creative arts. It's about people engaging with those artifacts, those productions, those processes, for their cultural life, for their well-being, for their inspiration and education. So what heritage has got is often collections. Again, those might feel like liabilities to look after. And I know from my Seven Stories board membership about that. A great gift, fantastic. Big insurance bill, less fantastic. But I think for me, it's about using those thinking, how can we use those assets and the byproducts of those assets ever more creatively, ever more productively for revenue. Again, I can only talk from an English limited English experience. I don't think we use the collections in our museums and galleries to create income. Hardly at all. Most of it is still at pencils and erasers in the shop for the school visit stage, and I think we could do a lot better than that.
There is a fantastic museum in the south of England, and I can't remember what it's called, that's completely remodelled itself and is calling itself a social enterprise.
The Museum of East Anglian Life, is that the one you mean? Yeah. There's a live debate in the museums world in the UK about collections, though. Actually, there are some people kind of arguing for disinvestment of some of those collections, and moving away from collections-based museums engagement to other forms. I'm not sure they've gone as far as the business model. I think their interest is in the engagement model. Actually, at the moment, there may be a business model as well. It certainly would, yeah, but I don't think that's their starting point. I think their starting point is people are less interested in collections now. I'm not sure about that personally, but I think that is a debate that's going on.
Mark, you mentioned Leanne Dodd from Queensland Writers Centre. You mentioned that philanthropy is a fairly new thing in Australia. I attended a seminar recently where they brought some ideas back from New York, and one of the things they said was Australia has a culture of giving, but not a culture of asking. Can you give us any examples from the UK of the way that they do it there that could help us here?
That culture of asking is absolutely, that's where we are in the UK. I think it's only the big building-based London national organisations, London-based national organisations that have had that culture of giving. It's been developing, but it's slow. So I'm not sure I have got lots of examples, to be perfectly honest. Some of it does go down through to board membership, and I've no idea. This is a genuine kind of area of ignorance about how these things work in Australia. But I did some work in Canada last year, and similar to the States, they have very much the board has two main jobs: recruit the chief exec and raise the money. And the event I did, which was with opera companies, there were chief execs and chairs and vice chairs there, and I was really struck by how closely they worked together in a way that I've only seen in the UK when people have been going through capital developments. In steady state, most arts organisations in the UK, the chair and the chief exec, they get on and they're in touch, but they're not like that. Whereas I think because these people were raising money the whole time, they had created a much tighter way of working. And I do think that in the UK, we need to move to boards where at least some of the mix of membership is more fundraising orientated, because that's just not part of the culture at the moment on most organisations, certainly beyond the kind of 10, 15 largest ones. Again, draw my own experience. I remember I joined the board of 7 Stories, and the first board meeting, that board is chaired by someone who used to run a community foundation for the region, so was very much part of that fundraising world and was bringing some of those habits in. And that, I suppose that's an example. Tapping those people on their community feel, wanting to put something back in the community where they've made their money. But he'd suggested that board members contribute to an appeal. We had a kind of match funding target set by a philanthropist. And it caused ructions, to be perfectly honest, because it wasn't what people felt they'd signed up for. Because it isn't part of the deal for most board members in the UK at the moment, that you would be expected to either put some money in yourself or know some rich people who might. And it won't be for a while. So I think that's one of the areas where it is changing. The making the ask, there is work going on to sort of bring in and develop fundraisers to do that, but it's a challenge.
I can add a little bit to that. What's happened in the UK, and this is terrific, isn't it? I mean, that's a country who's supposed to have no money at all. The government have actually just put £100 million on the table for Arts Council England to do 3 things. One, start some endowments, to put matching funding on the table for endowment building. And there's just been 18 organisations announced with millions of dollars to help start or build up their endowment. Secondly, to do a matching philanthropy scheme. And they're putting several tens of millions on the table to do a matching philanthropy scheme. Now, I think it's one of my beliefs that that's what we're going to see. One of the things that we might see come out of National Cultural Policy, or at least the new BAF organisation, or whatever it's going to be called, the new arts business organisation here, potentially will be looking at matching philanthropy. And the other is they've put some money into capacity building. The other thing that's big in the UK that I keep saying is worth us looking at here are community foundations. Now, community foundations are that collective responsibility within a geographical community of raising the stake within your donors. And I went to the Community Foundation conference in Newcastle about 18 months ago, and it was fascinating to see the scale of those organisations, just how many people in the community were giving to the Community Foundation, and the fact that they had, several of them had arts programmes coming out of Community Foundations. So maybe that's another model that we need to look at some point.
Hi, Mark. Steve Beardsley from ArtsLink Queensland. I really love your work, and since I've joined ArtsLink, I've done a lot of work with Kathy in utilising a lot of your work and thinking for the organisation, because I really am keen about getting the capacity and the adaptive resilience built into our organisation, and it's required. I suppose the question I've got, though, is in terms of what experiences can you share or give us some stories about what do the government think about it? You know, have you crossed that little boundary there, and you know, what sort of responses do you get? Because I'm looking to see how over here in Australia we can reduce that us and them scenario, which, you know, I hope maybe I'm speaking out of term in the room, but hopefully I'm not. But I think, you know, we've got to reduce that and keep it to a minimum. I mean, I think the image you have on the screen, that's what we've got to be doing. We've got to be talking and working together in order to build the sector.
The idea of people being resilient, because it will cost them less. But what we've got in the UK at the moment is also a sort of restructuring, not just to the scale of public investment, but the nature of it, not just in the arts, but across. So I think the government, from what I understand from colleagues at Arts Council, are supportive of that. They see philanthropy as an element of that, and I think that's partly financial, but it's also about those, you know, networks and collaborative ties aspects. We are encouraged very much to think local rather than regional in the UK at the moment. So it's very much about local benefit and local ties, and then within a national policy. I don't think they really get the kinds of investment that might really make a difference. You know, so I think some of the capital investment that Arts Council are putting in is prioritising resilience, things that will make organisations more resilient. But it's of a scale that is just going to scratch the surface, to be honest. And the money is by and large going to go to the big boys. Whereas I think, actually, if I was going to say something to government, I would be saying you should talk to Arts Council about putting 200 million into smaller scale resilience funds for organisations where you could really make a difference and get the money to work across. You know, I think part of the problem is that we think when we think through arts budgets, we're automatically restricted in scale. But particularly in some cities, arts organisations are quite major employers, actually. I mean, the town where I live is economically blighted, to be perfectly honest. And the arts centre probably employs more people than almost any other business in the town centre. because the only other things in the town centre are a few shops and some charity shops. So the arts centre employing 25 people is quite large, just in that town centre, not the whole area. You know, we are businesses as well, and I think we sometimes forget that, and we also make a big contribution to the vibrancy of the cities. So I'm not sure I've got many great winning stories of how we're working with the British government, but the arts are not alone in that at the moment.
What time for one more question? I think the one light on the horizon with that one is potentially also from some philanthropists, because the grant makers for the arts in America have realised that they're actually not dealing with this resilience thing, and have got together and are now trying to create some funds through philanthropy to actually build resilience in partnership. And I think we've got a chance here in partnership with government. I think Arts Queensland is seriously looking at this in terms of what needs to happen in the context of new types of money, if there's ever new money that does come, and where those partnerships are. And it's certainly, from a forester's point of view, something that we're looking at very seriously in terms of where it's needed to build organisations up to a capacity where investment from other sources, including financing from loans, can come into the scenario. So I think it's being looked at, but I think it's just, and that's the sense I get when I go back to the UK, is that everybody's playing around in the same space, and we just still haven't quite cracked it, but we know it needs to happen. On behalf of everybody in the room, and certainly on behalf of ourselves, Positive Solutions, Board Connect, and Arts Queensland in particular, who actually enabled this to happen, can I thank you all very